My brother-in-law mocked my old fishing boat. He pointed at his massive yacht and laughed. I owned the marina he was docked in. The next morning, his yacht was towed away. That happened on a Saturday afternoon in June at Stillwater Marina on the Georgia coast, just outside Brunswick. His name is Craig Forsyth, 47 years old, commercial insurance broker from Atlanta. The kind of man who believed that the size of what you owned communicated the size of who you were, and who spent a significant amount of energy making sure everyone around him understood both of those measurements. He was standing on the dock in deck shoes that looked like they had never touched a deck, pointing at his 42-foot marquee yacht called Second Wind, which was docked in slip 14 of the marina I had purchased 11 months earlier. I was in slip 9 with the 18-foot Carolina skiff I had been fishing from for 6 years. He walked over. He stood at the edge of my slip. He said, "Ray, I have to be honest. Every time I see that boat next to mine, it makes me feel a little embarrassed for you." He laughed. His friend Keith, who had driven down from Atlanta with him, laughed. My sister Lynn, who had been married to Craig for 14 years, and who had the specific expression she wore when she knew Craig was doing something he should not be doing, and who also knew from long experience that telling him so would produce a longer conversation than she had energy for, looked at the water. I looked at Craig. I said, "I appreciate the concern." He said, "Ray, come on. You are 60 years old. You have been fishing from the same beat-up skiff for years. You work at the boat yard. Lynn tells me you manage the marina now. At some point, you have to ask yourself when you are going to do better." I said, "I ask myself that regularly." He said, "What's the answer?" I said, "I think I am doing pretty well." He laughed again. He walked back to his yacht. I watched him go. I thought about the marina's operating agreement on my desk at the office in the main building. The document that outlined the slip rental terms for all 47 slips at Stillwater Marina. The specific clause about the conditions under which a slip rental could be terminated with 24 hours notice. I thought about what Craig had brought into slip 14 with him, which I had discovered 3 days earlier when reviewing the marina's guest log, and which was a violation of 2 specific terms of the rental agreement. I went to my office. I made a call to my dock manager. I said, "Eddie, slip 14, Second Wind, the Marquis 42, what is the status on the violation documentation?" Eddie said, "Complete, photographed and logged as of Thursday." I said, 24-hour notice effective this evening. Standard towing protocol if not vacated by 10 tomorrow morning." Eddie said, "Yes, sir." I went back to my boat. I kept fishing. At 10:07 the next morning, the towing company pulled Second Wind out of slip 14. Craig called me at 10:22. He was not calm. He said, "Ray, what the hell is happening with my boat?" I said, "There was a rental agreement violation, Craig. 2 actually. We documented them Thursday and issued the 24-hour notice yesterday evening." He said, "What violation? I have been coming to this marina for 3 years." I said, "The previous management may have been less rigorous about enforcement. The current management is not." He said, "Who is the current management? I am going to have a conversation with them." I said, "You already are." Silence. He said, "What?" I said, "I purchased Stillwater Marina 11 months ago. My name is on the deed. You can verify that at the Glynn County Courthouse if you would like. My dock manager Eddie manages the day-to-day operation. I manage the business." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man whose system was rebooting. He said, "You own the marina." I said, "Yes." He said, "Since when?" I said, 11 months. He said, "And you never?" I said, "Nobody asked." That is the complete story of what happened on that dock. What comes next, what you actually came here to hear, is everything that came before it, where I came from, how I built what I built, why a man who owned a marina was standing in slip 9 with an 18-foot fishing boat that his brother-in-law felt embarrassed for him about. That story starts a long time before that Saturday afternoon. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you are new here, leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from. Every week a new story. Let us get into it. My name is Raymond Dillard, and I am 60 years old. I grew up in Brunswick, Georgia, right on the coast. The specific kind of coastal Georgia childhood that people who grew up somewhere else described as idyllic when they heard about it, and that the people who actually lived it understood as harder and more real than the word idyllic suggested. My father, Walt Dillard, was a commercial fisherman for 31 years. He ran a 30-foot shrimp boat out of the St. Simons waterway from the time he was 22 until he was 53, at which point his body had given him a clear message that 31 years of hauling gear in the Georgia heat had accumulated in ways that were not reversible. He was the most physically capable man I have ever known, and by the time he retired, he moved like someone who had used himself completely and without apology for 3 decades. He was also the most honest person I have ever known. Honest in the simple, direct way. He said what he thought. He did what he said. He expected the same from everyone around him and was specifically patient with the people who tried and specifically impatient with the people who performed trying without doing it. My mother, Diane, worked as a school cafeteria manager for 26 years in the Brunswick City school system. She fed several thousand children a year, and she did it with the specific care of someone who understood that the meal she was providing was sometimes the most reliable thing in a child's day. She knew the kids who came through the line with the look of someone who had not eaten since the previous day's lunch, and she made sure those kids got a little more without making them feel seen in the wrong way. She was a quiet woman who communicated primarily through what she did rather than what she said. I inherited something from both of them. From my father, I got the water, the specific relationship with coastal Georgia that grew up in me from the time I could sit still in a boat, which was younger than most people expected. The way the tidal marshes looked in the early morning, the sound of an outboard motor starting in the dark before sunrise, the specific satisfaction of bringing something back from the water that fed people. From my mother, I got the patience to watch a situation completely before deciding what it required. Those two things, the water and the patience, are what built everything I eventually built. School in Brunswick was public school in a system that had good teachers and inadequate resources in the specific combination that characterized public education in the rural South in the 1970s and early 1980s. I was a solid student without being an exceptional one. What I was exceptional at was working. From the age of 14, I worked at Hawkins Boat Yard on the south side of Brunswick, sweeping, cleaning the basic bottom of the marine trades. By 16, I was helping with actual boat repair work. By 18, I understood fiberglass, engine maintenance, hull work, and the specific economics of a boat yard that made its money from a combination of seasonal slip rentals, repair work, and fuel sales. I absorbed all of it. I graduated high school in 1983, and I went to coastal Georgia Community College for 2 years and studied marine technology and business administration simultaneously. The marine technology because it formalized what I had been learning at Hawkins. The business administration because I had watched enough boat yards and fishing operations in Brunswick to understand that technical skill without business understanding produced capable workers and almost never produced owners. I wanted to be an owner. I graduated in 1985 and went back to Hawkins full-time as a senior repair technician. Frank Hawkins, who was 67 and who had been running the yard since 1961, recognized immediately that what had come back from 2 years of college was not the same person who had left, and that the difference was worth paying for. He gave me the shop foreman position in 1987. He gave me the yard manager position in 1990. In 1993, he sat me down in his office and told me he was thinking about what came after him. He said, "Ray, I have three options. I sell to a buyer I find through a broker. I sell to you. Or I find a family member who wants to run it, which I have looked for and have not found." I said, "What is the number for option 2? He told me. I said, "I need 18 months. He said, "You have 12. I got the financing in 11. It was not a simple financing. I had savings from 8 years of living well below my income, which was a deliberate choice I had made in 1987 when I understood that the goal required capital and that capital required discipline. I had enough for a meaningful down payment. The remainder came from a small business administration loan that required the most thorough application process I had encountered in my professional life, and that took 4 months to move through the system. Frank held the note on the remainder that the SBA loan did not cover. He did not have to do that. He did it because he had watched me for 8 years, and because he was the specific kind of man who believed that the people who had been present and reliable deserved the opportunity to own the thing they had helped build. I took possession of Hawkins Boat Yard in June of 1994. I changed the name to Dillard Marine Services. Frank came to the sign, changed the morning the new sign went up. He looked at it. He said, "Good name." He shook my hand. He went home. He passed away in 1997 at 71. He is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Brunswick, and I go by his grave every year on the anniversary of the sale. Subscribe right now. Stay with me because the next section is where the business gets real and where Craig Forsyth enters this story. Dillard Marine Services grew in the specific way that boat yards grew, slowly, with the specific patience of a business that served a seasonal market, and that depended on trust and word of mouth in a community where trust and word of mouth were the primary currencies. By 2000, the yard had 12 full-time employees and a client list that covered most of the serious recreational boaters and a handful of commercial operators along the Golden Isles waterway. I want to tell you about the thing I was watching during those years because it produced the most significant business decision I ever made. Marina access. The Georgia coast had a specific problem that the people who worked on the water understood, and that the people who drove to the coast on weekends were less aware of. The existing marina infrastructure was aging. The large marinas that had been built in the 1960s and 1970s needed significant capital investment to remain competitive with the newer facilities being developed in Florida and South Carolina. Many of the smaller independent marinas were being sold to larger chains, or were simply closing because the families that owned them were reaching retirement age without successors who wanted to take them on. The gap this created was real. There were more boats on the Georgia coast than there were quality slip spaces for them. The boaters who wanted reliable, well-maintained slips within reach of Brunswick and the Golden Isles were competing for a limited supply. I saw this clearly from the boat yard. Every client conversation about where they kept their boat was also a conversation about the shortcomings of the current options. I started saving with a specific target in mind in 2002. Stillwater Marina was a 12-acre property on the Brunswick waterway about 4 miles south of the boat yard. It had been in the Hendricks family since 1959. Margaret Hendricks, who had managed it with her late husband Carl from 1959 until he passed in 2008, ran it alone after Carl died with the specific determined competence of a woman in her late 70s who understood the property completely and who was not going to let anyone tell her it was too much for her. It was too much for her in the physical sense. The docks needed work, the fuel system needed updating, the grounds needed attention, but the bones were excellent: the location, the depth, the access to the waterway, the 47 slip capacity, Everything that was hard to create was already there. I watched Stillwater for 4 years. I had a conversation with Margaret in 2015 when I brought my skiff in for fuel, and she mentioned, in the passing way that she mentioned things that her daughter in Savannah had been asking her to think about the future. I said, "Margaret, if you ever decide the future looks like selling, I would like to have the first conversation." She looked at me. She said, "Ray Dillard, you have been fishing off this dock since you were 15 years old." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Your father kept his boat here for 20 years." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You understand what this place is supposed to be?" I said, "I do." She said, "When the time comes, you will be the first call." She called me in the fall of 2022. She said, "Ray, my daughter is right. The time has come." The acquisition took 4 months. Fair price, complex negotiation because the property had some deferred maintenance that required honest accounting, full financing from a regional bank in Brunswick that I had a 15-year relationship with. I closed on Stillwater Marina in July of 2023. I told almost nobody. My staff at the boat yard knew because the operations required coordination. My banker knew. My attorney knew. My daughter Ellen knew because she was the person I called when anything significant happened. I did not tell my sister Lynn, which meant I did not tell Craig. Craig had been coming to Stillwater since 2020. He had been renting Slip 14 annually, one of the larger premium slips suitable for his 42-foot yacht. He was exactly the kind of seasonal recreational boater who generated significant slip revenue for the marina. He paid the annual fee on time. He came down for long weekends in spring and summer, and he treated the marina as a backdrop for the specific performance of affluent coastal leisure that was his primary mode of being on the Georgia coast. He also, I had discovered during my review of the marina's files in August of 2023, had a pattern with the previous management. He had gotten away with things. Not criminal things. The specific category of things that people got away with when they were confident, loud, and accustomed to having their preferences accommodated. He had brought unauthorized guests onto the dock at hours that violated the quiet policy. He had stored equipment in the common area in ways the rental agreement prohibited. He had twice brought aboard a generator-powered sound system for evening parties that exceeded the noise ordinance limits. The previous management had documented the first 2 incidents and had said nothing because Craig was a reliable paying customer, and the previous management's philosophy was that reliable paying customers got some latitude. My philosophy was different. The rules applied to everyone equally. When Craig arrived the second weekend of June with second wind, he brought a charcoal grill that he bolted to the aft railing of the yacht. Open flame grills were explicitly prohibited in the slip rental agreement. The prohibition was there because a marina with 47 boats in close proximity had a genuine fire risk that open flame grills on deck made significantly worse. Eddie documented it Thursday morning. Eddie issued the 24-hour notice Saturday evening. At 10:07 Sunday morning, second wind was towed to a temporary holding facility. Craig's call came 15 minutes later. I told him what I told you in the intro. He said you own the marina, and then the silence happened, and then we talked for about 10 more minutes. He wanted the boat back immediately. I said, "The boat is secure. You can retrieve it from the holding facility, and you have the standard grace period to vacate Slip 14 and retrieve any personal property from the dock." He said, "Ray, this is family." I said, "Craig, the rental agreement you signed applies to every slip holder equally. The violation was real and documented." He said, "I have been renting that slip for 3 years." I said, "Yes, and the previous management chose not to enforce the agreement. That was their decision. My decision is different." He said, I want to talk to Lynn. I said, you can call Lynn. He said, you know she is going to say. I said, Craig, Lynn has her own views and she is welcome to share them with me. The business decision has been made. He said, this is not over. I said, I hope it is over and that you enjoy wherever you dock second wind next. He hung up. Subscribe right now because the next section is where Lynn calls and where the family situation becomes the story inside the story. Lynn called at noon. My sister and I had a specific relationship that I want to describe accurately because it matters for the rest of this story. Lynn was 3 years younger than me. We had grown up in the same Brunswick household, and we had the specific closeness of 2 children whose parents worked hard and who therefore spent significant portions of their childhoods as each other's primary company. She knew me the way that kind of proximity produced knowledge, completely, with the specific understanding that came from watching someone through decades of situations. She had married Craig in 2009. I had attended the wedding and I had met Craig before the wedding on 3 occasions, and I had the specific assessment of Craig that I had maintained since those first meetings. He was capable, he was charming in the surface way, and he had a habit of placing himself at the top of every hierarchy he encountered that produced the specific behavior I had watched for 14 years. I had said none of this to Lynn. She was happy in her marriage in the specific complicated way that people were happy in marriages that had real elements of both genuine connection and significant friction. She loved Craig in the real way. She also managed Craig the way the people who loved difficult men managed them, with patience and with the specific skill of redirecting energy before it created damage. She had not managed the Saturday dock situation in time. She called at noon. She said, Ray. I said, Lynn. She said, Craig is losing his mind. I said, I know. She said, he told me you own the Marina. I said, yes. She said, when did that happen? I said, almost a year ago. She said, you never told me. I said, you never asked about my business interests, and I have never made a practice of announcing them. She was quiet. She said, was what happened this morning necessary? I said, the violation was real and documented. The 24-hour notice was properly issued. The enforcement was by the book. She said, was it also about Saturday? I said, what happened Saturday? She said, Ray. I said, the violation documentation started Thursday, before Saturday. She said, but you knew about the violation before Saturday. I said, yes. She said, and you still let Saturday play out the way it played out. I said, I went to the Marina on Saturday to fish. Craig came to my slip and made the comments he made. The enforcement timeline was already in motion before those comments happened. She said, but you could have mentioned owning the Marina at any point on Saturday. I said, yes. She said, why didn't you? I was quiet for a moment. I said, Lynn, I have watched Craig manage situations for 14 years. I have watched him treat people based on where he assessed them on his personal hierarchy. I have been in his lower category for 14 years because I work at a boat yard and fish from an 18-foot skiff and live in Brunswick and do not make the kind of money he makes in Atlanta commercial insurance. She said, he can be like that. I said, on Saturday he stood at my slip and told me my boat made him feel embarrassed for me. That comment came from someone who had no idea he was standing in a marina I owned, so I let him continue not knowing. She said, and then enforced the rental violation. I said, yes. She was quiet. She said, that is cold, Ray. I said, the violation was real. She said, and the timing was deliberate. I said, I am honest about that. She said, what do you want from this? I said, Lynn, I want Craig to understand that the way he assigns value to people based on what he can see has a consistent gap in it. The gap is the thing he cannot see. He cannot see my boat yard revenue. He cannot see the marina deed. He cannot see what I have built here over 30 years. He sees an 18-foot skiff and a boat yard worker, and he makes his assessment. She said, and you want him to update the assessment. I said, I want him to understand there is an assessment problem. Whether he updates it is his business. She said, this is going to be a difficult summer. I said, I know. She said, are you going to re-rent him the slip? I said, I offered Craig the opportunity to re-sign the rental agreement with a full review of the terms and a documented acknowledgement of the violations. She said, he is not going to do that. I said, I know. She said, so you are losing a paying customer. I said, Slip 14 is already released to a couple from Savannah who have been on the wait list for 2 years. She was quiet. She said, you had it ready. I said, I run a business, Lynn. I plan for contingencies. She said, Craig is going to hold on to this. I said, Craig can hold on to it. He can also come back to Brunswick next summer and decide whether the man who managed a boat yard for 30 years and bought the marina where he docked is someone whose assessment system has a gap in it. She said, you sound like Dad. I said, I take that as a compliment. She said, it is one. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Ray, tell me something honestly. I said, ask. She said, are you okay? Like genuinely, you live alone here. You work every day, you fish by yourself. I worry about you. I said, Lynn. She said, I know you have the business. I know you have built something real here. I am asking about the rest of it. I said, the rest of it is good. I have what I need. I have the water, I have the yard, I have the marina. I have you and Ellen and the 2 grandsons. I am doing fine. She said, I believe you. She said, I also think you spent too many years not letting people see what you were building and that it cost you some things. I said, yes, it did. She said, Carolyn. I said, yes. My ex-wife, Carolyn. We had been married for 9 years and we had separated in 2008. Ellen was born in 2001. Carolyn and I had the specific failure of 2 people who wanted different versions of a life in coastal Georgia, and who did not understand clearly enough how different those versions were, until Ellen was 7 and the distance between what Carolyn needed and what I was offering had become undeniable. She had wanted more social life, more travel, more of the specific version of success that was visible and acknowledged. I had been building something that was quiet and long, and that did not produce visible external confirmation until years after the decisions that produced it. She had needed to see the confirmation earlier than I was able to provide it. That was the honest accounting. Lynn had watched all of this from 3 years behind me. She said, I love you, Ray. I said, I love you, Lynn. Tell Craig I meant what I said about the boat being secure. She said, he knows. She said, he is also going to need some time. I said, he has all the time he needs. She hung up. I made coffee. I went back to the marina. The dock was quiet on Sunday afternoon. Most of the slip holders were out on the water. The Georgia coast in June had the specific quality it had: the water warm and green, the marsh grass doing what marsh grass did, the smell of salt and diesel, and the specific combination that had been the smell of my entire life. I stood on the dock at slip 9. The Carolina skiff was tied up where it had always been. I looked at slip 14. Empty now. The water moved through where second wind had been. I went back to my office. I had a marina to run. Subscribe right now and keep going, because the next section is the part most people are going to miss if they stop here. I want to tell you what Dillard Marine Services and Stillwater Marina actually were by June of 2024. Because the story of Craig and the yacht and the Sunday morning tow was a moment in a much larger picture, and the moment only makes sense when you understand the picture. Dillard Marine Services by 2024 had been operating for 30 years. It had 18 full-time employees and seasonal staff that brought the total to 26 during peak season. The yard did engine work, hull repair, fiberglass, electrical systems, interior restoration, and anything else that a boat needed to be operational and safe. We had commercial clients from the Georgia shrimping industry and recreational clients from the full range of Georgia coast boat owners. Annual revenue at the yard was in the range of $3.4 million. Stillwater Marina, at the end of its first full year under my ownership, had 47 occupied slips at an average annual rate that reflected the premium the location commanded. The fuel dock was operating. The ship store was operating. The yacht service contracts I had developed between the marina and the boat yard, where Stillwater clients got priority scheduling at Dillard Marine, were producing cross-revenue that benefited both operations. The marina's first full-year revenue was just over $1.1 million. Combined, Dillard Marine Services and Stillwater Marina were generating about $4.5 million in annual revenue, with margins that reflected the specific efficiency of operations, where the owner also understood the work. I say this not to perform a number at you, but because the number is the context for what Craig had been saying to me for 14 years, and for what he said on Saturday, and for what happened Sunday morning. The man who felt embarrassed for me and my skiff was standing on a dock I owned. He had been paying slip rental to me for 11 months without knowing it. He had been, in the specific way he managed situations, performing affluence at the marina of a man who had spent 30 years quietly building something real while Craig was performing. I want to be clear about something. I have no animus toward Craig. People who organize their understanding of other people around external signals of financial success are not unusual. It is a common thing. It is a thing that certain environments produce and that certain personalities are particularly susceptible to. Craig had spent his career in commercial insurance in Atlanta, and in that environment, external signals of financial position were part of how business was done and how people assessed each other. He had brought that framework everywhere with him, including to his family relationships, including to the Brunswick waterway. He was wrong about me. He was wrong in the same way for 14 years. The Saturday dock moment and the Sunday tow were the specific situation that made the wrongness visible to him. What happened after that was the part I had not fully planned. He called me again on a Tuesday, 2 days after the Sunday morning tow. He said, "Ray, I want to have a real conversation." I said, "Okay." He said, "Can I come to the yard?" I said, "Yes." He drove down from Atlanta on Wednesday. He came to the boat yard at 10 in the morning. He came in his personal car, not the truck he drove when he was bringing the yacht gear. He was in ordinary clothes. He sat across from my desk in my office, and he was the version of Craig I had seen maybe twice in 14 years, the version without the performance. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Okay." He said, "Not just for the dock, for years of it." I said, "Tell me what you mean." He said, "I have been treating you like someone who did not make it. Every time we were together, every family thing. I made comments about the boat, about living in Brunswick, about the boat yard. I was doing it consciously and I was telling myself it was just how I talked." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sitting here now because Lynn told me the full picture. The yard revenue, the marina purchase, everything." I said, "Lynn should not have had to tell you. You could have asked me any time in 14 years what I was building." He said, "I know." He said, "The reason I never asked is the reason this is an apology rather than just an explanation. I never asked because I had already decided the answer and I did not want to be wrong." I looked at him. He said, "I made an assessment of you in 2009 when Lynn introduced us, And I maintained that assessment without updating it because updating it would have meant I had been wrong, and I am not good at being wrong. I said, "No, you are not." He said, "Is that going to change?" I said, "I do not know. That is up to you." He said, "I think I want it to." I said, "Okay." He said, "What does that look like?" I said, "It looks like the same thing it looks like for everyone. You stop making assessments based on what you can see, and you start asking questions about what you cannot see. Every time." He said, "And if I do that?" I said, "Then you will probably be wrong less often." He said, "And between us?" I said, "Craig, you are married to my sister. You are the grandfather of my grandson's first cousins. We are going to be in each other's lives for a long time. Whether that is comfortable or uncomfortable is mostly up to you." He said, "What would make it comfortable?" I said what I just said: ask questions, update assessments, stop performing and start being present. He said, "That is harder than it sounds." I said, "I know." He was quiet. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The 18-foot skiff. You own a marina. You have a successful boat yard. You could have anything you wanted on that dock." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why the skiff?" I said, "Because that is the boat I fish from. It is the right size for the places I go. It does what I need it to do." He said, "You are not making a statement with it." I said, "I am not trying to make any statement with it." He said, "That is what I missed." I said, "Yes." He said, "For 14 years I thought the skiff was telling me something about you." I said, "It was telling you I like to fish." He looked at me. He said, "Yeah." He said, "Just that." I said, "Just that." He left an hour later. He went back to Atlanta. He called Lynn that evening and told her he had been to see me. Lynn called me. She said, "What happened?" I said, "He came and we talked." She said, "And?" I said, "And we will see what comes next." She said, "That is all." I said, "That is the whole thing, Lynn. That is what all of these situations come down to. What comes next?" Subscribe right now. The final section is where the rest of this lands. Summer moved on the way Georgia summers moved, hot, humid, with the specific quality of light on the water in the long evenings that I had been looking at my whole life, and that still stopped me sometimes. Slip 14 was occupied by Dale and Connie Perkins from Savannah, who had been on the wait list for 2 years and who were exactly the kind of marina clients that a marina was designed for. They used the slip regularly. They maintained their boat properly. They respected the dock rules, and they were genuinely glad to be there in a way that showed every time they arrived. Second Wind was docked at a private marina in Sea Island, where Craig had found a slip on short notice. I knew this because Lynn mentioned it in a call in late June. She also mentioned that Craig had been quieter than usual since his trip to Brunswick, that he had been thinking about things. I said, "Good." She said, "He told me he wants to talk to you this fall." I said, "My door is open." In August, Ellen came down from Savannah with my 2 grandsons, Marcus, who was 8, and Sam, who was 6. We spent 3 days on the water, morning fishing trips on the skiff, afternoons at the marina watching the boats come and go, evenings on the dock at the boatyard where I had been fixing boats for 40 years. Marcus was interested in the mechanical work. He followed Eddie around the yard asking questions with the specific rapid-fire curiosity of an 8-year-old who was genuinely interested and who had the patience that interested children had when they were getting real answers. Sam was interested in the fish, specifically in the process of catching them, which he considered the most important activity available to anyone anywhere at any time. On the last morning, I took them out on the skiff at 5:30 in the early dark. The water was flat. The marsh was doing the morning thing it did in August, the specific warm green smell of low tide and full summer. Marcus sat in the bow and watched the waterway. Sam was at the stern with a child-sized rod that I had bought when Ellen first brought him to visit 3 years earlier. I ran the engine. Nobody talked. There was nothing that needed saying. After a while, Marcus turned around and said, "Grandpa, is this your boat or the Marina's boat?" I said, "Mine. This one is mine personally." He said, "How come you have a small boat if you own the whole marina?" I said, "Because this is the right size for fishing." He said, "But you could have a big one." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why don't you?" I said, "Because I am not trying to have a big one. I am trying to catch fish." He thought about this for a moment. He said, "Okay." He turned back to the waterway. Sam caught a redfish 40 minutes later. It was small enough that we released it, but Sam's reaction was the reaction of someone who had just done the most important thing a person could do. We came back in at 8. Ellen was on the dock with coffee. She looked at Sam carrying the rod and Marcus carrying the tackle box, and she looked at me and she said, "Good morning." I said, "Excellent morning." She said, "He talked about fish for a solid 30 minutes before he fell asleep last night." I said, "Sounds about right." She handed me the coffee. We stood on the dock of Stillwater Marina in the August morning and watched the water. She said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." She said, "Lynn told me about Craig." I said, "What specifically?" She said, "About the apology, about what he said to you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think he means it?" I said, "I think he means it today. Whether it holds in practice is what I will learn over time." She said, "You are patient with people." I said, "Some people." She said, "Most people." She was quiet. She said, "Were you patient with Mom when things were hard?" I said, "I was slow, which is different from patient. I let things develop without addressing them because I was focused on building the business, and I thought the addressing could wait." She said, "And it could not." I said, "No." She said, "Do you regret it?" I said, "I regret the way the marriage ended. I have never regretted building what I built here. Those two things are both true." She said, "I think you are more settled now than I have ever seen you." I said, "I have everything I need." She said, "The marina." I said, "The marina, the yard, you and the boys, the water." "Yes." She said, "And a skiff that embarrasses Craig Forsyth." I said, "Only when he is standing next to it." She laughed. Real laughter. The morning was on the water, and the boys were on the dock throwing pieces of dock line at each other, and the coffee was good, and the Georgia coast was doing the specific thing it always did in August, which was to be completely itself without apology. Craig came back to Brunswick in October. He came alone. He parked at the boat yard and came to my office, and we went to lunch at a seafood place on the waterfront that had been there since 1976 and where I had been eating for 30 years. We talked for 2 hours. About the marina, about the boat yard, about what I had been building and why and what it had cost along the way. He asked questions. He listened to the answers without managing the conversation toward a predetermined conclusion. He was the version of himself that the Wednesday in August had suggested was available. At the end of lunch, he said, "I want to come back next summer, as a slip holder, if there is availability." I said, "I will check the wait list and let you know." He said, "The wait list?" I said, "We have demand." He said, "I know." He said, "Are the rules the same for everyone?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Including the no charcoal grill rule?" I said, "Especially that one." He said, "I can live with that." He shook my hand when we left. It was a different handshake from the ones in the previous 14 years. I drove back to the marina. The afternoon light was on the water and the marsh and the dock and the 47 slips with their boats, and the specific quality of Stillwater Marina on an October afternoon in Brunswick, Georgia, was the quality of something that had been here for 65 years, and that was going to be here for 65 more. I went to my office. I had a marina to run. I have been fishing the Georgia coast since I was old enough to sit still in a boat. My father took me out on the waterway for the first time when I was 5 years old, and I remember the specific quality of that morning. The dark before sunrise, the sound of the outboard, the marsh waking up around us, the specific feeling of being in a small boat on water that was larger than the boat, and understanding that this was the correct relationship between a person and the natural world they lived in. That relationship has been the organizing principle of my life. Everything I built, the boat yard, the marina, the career that Craig spent 14 years assessing as insufficient, everything was built in service of staying on this water and staying connected to the work that the water required. The Saturday dock moment and the Sunday tow were not the point of this story. The point is what Craig missed for 14 years by looking at an 18-foot skiff and deciding he already knew what it meant. The point is that the most significant things are frequently the things that make the least noise. My father ran a shrimp boat for 31 years. He made a modest living. He was not wealthy by any measure Craig would have recognized. He was also the man from whom I learned everything that built $4.5 million in annual revenue over 30 years of quiet work on the Brunswick waterway. The skiff is mine. I fish from it because it is the right size for the places I go. If Craig had asked me about it before Saturday instead of after, I would have told him the same thing. He never asked. Most people never do. They look at what they can see and they make their assessment, and they maintain it because maintaining it is easier than the alternative, which is to ask questions and listen to the answers and update what you believe. Craig is updating what he believes. Whether he gets a slip at Stillwater next summer depends on the wait list. The rules are the same for everyone. Drop a comment right now. Tell me about the thing in your life that people have looked at and gotten wrong. Tell me about the building that nobody sees yet. Tell me where you are watching from. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. I put out a new story every single week, and every one of them earns your time. Thank you for being here.